"I'm out of here," I said, my voice cold and deliberate. "Fine, and don't bother coming back." Jenna shot back, her tone sharp enough to cut. Normally, I'd follow up with a snarky, "Go to hell," as I slammed the door behind me, but not today. This time, I aimed for something more civil, if only slightly. Over our 14 years of marriage, we'd exchanged countless verbal jabs, the kind that stung but never seemed fatal. This time, though, it was different. She didn't know it yet, but I wasn't coming back. In a few days, she'd realize just how serious I was. Over the last 6 months, Jenna had turned into some kind of verbal wrecking ball, tearing me down with every word. I couldn't figure it out. Her sharp remarks, once manageable, began cutting deeper and deeper. I started doing everything I could to avoid her, hoping to keep the peace. Most days, I'd linger in my car after work, scrolling aimlessly on my phone or flipping through the radio just to kill time. Sometimes I wouldn't even come home until after Jenna and our 13-year-old daughter, Carrie, had eaten dinner. On good days, there'd be leftovers waiting for me. Lately, though, it seemed like those leftovers were disappearing before I even got the chance. The name's Kurt Kaminski. Technically, it's David Kurt Kaminski, but my dad's also a David. So they started calling me Kurt from the start to avoid confusion. Not that I'd mind being a junior, or even going by DJ, but nope, just Kurt. Or sometimes Nat. I'm Polish, or, well, sort of. An American with Polish roots, to be exact. I've heard every Polish joke you can think of, and trust me, they're still cranking out new ones every year. In this small town of about 10,000, I'm the only Pole I know, apart from my dad, so I end up being the butt of a lot of jokes. Technically, I'm only half Polish. Mom's side is a mix of German, French, Irish, and English, but since I carry the Kaminski name, everyone sees me as the Polish guy. Jenna, my soon-to-be ex-wife, wasn't who I thought she was. I found out the hard way 4 weeks ago. As I mentioned, I'd been avoiding her because of the constant jabs and tension. One Monday evening, after skipping yet another awkward dinner, I hit up a local diner. I was sitting in a booth, about to order, when I overheard a conversation in the booth behind me. 2 guys talking. "So, how long you been with the Polish guy's missus?" one asked. "Since they got hitched," the other replied casually. "Heck, I even betted her on their wedding day. And he's clueless." The first voice I didn't recognize, but the second one, I knew it like the back of my hand. It was George Carey, my best friend. I froze. The words kept coming, but they blurred into nothing until George added with a laugh, "Yeah, we meet up at least twice a month. Kurt's so clueless it's hilarious." I couldn't breathe. The waitress came to take my order, but I barely managed to mumble, "Sorry, I've got to go." I slid out of the booth and bolted for the door, making sure they didn't see me. My head was spinning. Jenna, my wife, was sleeping with George, my closest friend, the same guy who had stood beside me as my best man on our wedding day, the guy I trusted to fix all my cars. You see, George isn't just my best friend. He's my mechanic, too. Or at least, he was. Not officially. I never put him on staff, but he worked exclusively on my vehicles. I run a used car dealership, so I keep him busy, and I pay him well. Business is good, great. Actually, people know I sell reliable cars at fair prices, and if something goes wrong, I make it right. George has always been a solid mechanic. I wanted to hire him full-time, but he joked about not being able to respect himself if he worked for a Pole. He said it with a laugh, but I always suspected there was some truth behind it. So, I kept him as an independent contractor, even though I was his sole source of income. And now, that fact would be his undoing. Leaving the diner that night, I knew one thing for sure. Everything was about to change. I cruised the streets, replaying George's words in my head, doubting what I'd overheard. Was he telling the truth, or just running his mouth to impress someone? Maybe they were meeting, but if their encounters were as rare as he claimed, hiring a private investigator might end up being a waste of money. Still, I couldn't let it go. I decided to start closer to home, by snooping through Jenna's phone and email. When I got back, Jenna was acting as normal as ever, which was fine by me. I needed concrete evidence before I could confront her. That night, once she fell asleep, I slipped her phone off the nightstand. Her email was clean, nothing out of the ordinary. Her phone was locked, but it didn't take me long to crack it. Her passcode was our daughter's birth date. I scrolled through her messages, finding a few vague ones that felt off, but nothing directly linked to George. His name was in her contacts, but that wasn't surprising, considering he was my friend. Maybe I'd misheard, or maybe George was just blowing smoke to sound important. Still, her recent behavior had me on edge. Something felt off, even if it wasn't with George. Restless, I finally crawled back into bed. It was well past 2:30 a.m. before I managed to drift off, my thoughts swirling with uncertainty. The next day at the dealership, George strolled in, cracking one of his usual Polish jokes. Normally, I let them slide, but not today. I snapped. "George, what do you even know about Poland? Bet you couldn't find it on a map if your life depended on it. You joke about Poles being dim, but I'm pretty sure they could locate the US, maybe even our state. Now get to work." He froze, clearly taken aback. For a guy who wasn't book smart, George had street smarts and knew when something was up. He said nothing, just slunk off to the garage. Watching him leave, I couldn't help but reconsider our friendship. We'd been close since high school, where I'd helped him with his studies to make sure he graduated. Now, I was questioning everything. Back in my office, I shut the door and started brainstorming. I couldn't just confront them head-on. They'd deny everything unless I had solid proof. I needed evidence. I called a private investigator in Santa Fe and explained my suspicions. He listened carefully and laid out my options. "Tracking her phone is the easiest and cheapest route," he said. "There are apps that run in the background without her knowing. Cameras at home could work too, but good ones are expensive, and even then, she might spot them." My advice? Start with the tracker and hope to catch something. He even recommended a specific program and refused payment. "It's all stuff you can find online anyway," he added. I thanked him for the advice and insisted on sending a check anyway. "If you're ever in Silver City, swing by Kaminsky's lot," I offered. "Doubt I'll be out that way," he said with a chuckle, "but you never know." That night, while Jenna and Carrie were fast asleep, I downloaded the tracking app onto her phone and synced it with mine. It was discreet, running unnoticed in the background. For the first time in days, I felt a sliver of control and managed to get some sleep. The next day at work, I kept an eye on the app. Jenna worked part-time at the university bookstore, about 15 to 20 hours a week. She called the money she earned mad money and usually spent it at the salon or on small indulgences. Her movements seemed routine: work, the grocery store, and then back home. George spent most of his day working, and their paths didn't seem to cross. For now, I found nothing suspicious. That evening, I suggested dinner out with Jenna and Carrie. To my surprise, Jenna seemed somewhat responsive, though Carrie, like most teenagers, needed some convincing. Dinner went smoothly. I tried to keep things casual but couldn't resist bringing up George. The way Jenna shifted uncomfortably and quickly changed the subject only fueled my suspicions. That night, I refrained from checking her phone, letting the evening play out. Before bed, I thanked Jenna for dinner. "Thanks for joining us tonight," I said. "Thank you, Kurt. It was a nice surprise," she replied, meeting my gaze. Her tone softened, and for the first time in months, there was a hint of warmth between us. She even hinted at intimacy later, something we hadn't shared in a while. I felt conflicted. If she had been unfaithful, did I even want this? But until I had proof, I decided to let her take the lead. The encounter was brief and unremarkable, but at least it happened. Throughout the week, I monitored the tracker and checked her phone while she slept. I found nothing out of the ordinary, no incriminating messages or calls. By Saturday night, I was starting to convince myself that maybe George had been lying to impress someone. He'd done it before, back in high school. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. At 2 a.m., as I lay in bed, my restless mind refused to let me sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, sleep evading me. Frustrated, I decided to head downstairs for a drink, hoping it would calm my restless mind. Sitting on the couch with a glass of Jack and Coke in one hand and Jenna's phone in the other, I stared at the screen. Once again, I entered her passcode, our daughter's birth date, and unlocked it. As the homepage lit up, a wave of memories washed over me. Carrie's birth had been anything but easy. Jenna's pregnancy had been riddled with complications, including issues with her Rh factor that caused her body to reject the baby. The last 3 weeks before delivery, Jenna was on strict bed rest. Carrie was born exactly 9 months after our wedding, and we were overjoyed by her healthy arrival. But raising her hadn't been smooth sailing. She cried endlessly, struggled to nurse, and barely slept. By the time she turned 2, Jenna had declared we weren't having another child. Though I was disappointed, I couldn't deny the toll it had taken on our lives. That thought lingered as another realization struck me. Carrie was born 9 months after the wedding, often referred to as a honeymoon baby. But what if George's claims were true? What if Jenna had been pregnant before the wedding? A cold chill ran through me. Jenna had been on the pill back then, but we'd never waited for marriage to be intimate. I recalled the doctor's theory that stress from the wedding might have rendered the pill ineffective. If the pills had failed around our wedding night, they could have failed earlier, too. The seed of doubt grew. There was a 50-50 chance I wasn't Carrie's biological father. My thoughts churned with anger, suspicion, and the desperate need for clarity. I set down my drink and went to the bathroom, grabbing a few cotton swabs. Carrie, now a teenager, finally had a steady sleep routine, but she'd been a challenging baby and toddler. Gently, I swabbed the inside of her cheek while she slept, sealing the sample in a plastic bag. Then I swabbed my own cheek, carefully storing both samples. Even if the results confirmed Carrie was biologically mine, questions about Jenna's faithfulness would remain unanswered. But I pushed that concern aside for now. Sunday was uneventful, filled with routine chores. I avoided both Jenna and Carrie, struggling to keep my emotions in check. My mind raced with doubt and anticipation. At one point, Jenna noticed my distraction. "Something on your mind, Kurt?" she asked casually. "I'm thinking about buying a batch of cars at the next auction to stock up the lot," I replied quickly. "It might stretch finances a bit until we sell a few." "Just don't overextend," she advised, always acting as if the business was ours, though it was solely mine. Her detached tone gnawed at me, but I needed her off my trail. Bright and early Monday morning, I drove to Western New Mexico University. I met with someone from the science department, explaining my request. They directed me to the department head, who seemed intrigued by the unusual task. I handed him a business card, offering a discount on any future car purchases for the department. "I've been thinking about replacing my Camry," he said with a nod. "I might take you up on that offer." "I'll make sure to find you something solid," I replied, leaving with a mix of hope and dread. As I walked back to my car, the weight of the test loomed large over me. These results could end my marriage. Back at work, I decided to turn my cover story into action. I summoned Paul, my accountant and occasional salesperson, into my office to discuss financial plans. "I want to clear the mortgage on my house," I told him. "Can we work out a lump sum payment?" "Let me crunch the numbers and get back to you," Paul replied, leaving me alone with my spiraling thoughts. Should I contact a family lawyer? No, I needed to wait. The test results would dictate my next steps. The next 2 days crawled by. Every moment was consumed with anticipation, the hours dragging like lead. Late Wednesday evening, my phone rang. It was the department head. "The samples aren't related," he confirmed softly. I nodded, though the words hit harder than I anticipated. Even with George's boastful claims, part of me had clung to the hope it wasn't true. After a brief pause, the department head added, "I'll stop by to discuss a car soon." When he arrived the following day, his face said it all before he spoke. As I ushered him into my office, he handed me the envelope with the results. I opened it, reading the words that left no room for doubt. Not a match. My hands trembled as I set the paper down. The world felt unsteady, but I forced myself to maintain composure. "So," I said, breaking the tension, "you were thinking about a car?" He smiled awkwardly, sensing the strain in my voice. "I've hit the big 5-0 and thought maybe it's time for a sports car. Been eyeing a Mazda Miata." "I'll find you one," I promised, using work as a distraction. "I'll check tomorrow's auction for a solid option and let you know." As he left, I sat alone, staring at the envelope. The results were definitive. My marriage, my trust in Jenna, and my identity as Carrie's father, they all hung by a thread. I decided I might leave early but assured myself I'd remain reachable if needed. Deep down, I knew Jenna wouldn't call. She rarely did. She was the type to handle things on her own. As I drove around the city, everything felt different, as though the world had shifted on its axis. With a sense of purpose, I called my lawyer. He expressed his sadness about my situation, but quickly referred me to a trusted colleague. After the call, I booked an evening appointment for the following day. Later, sitting at a small restaurant and picking at a half-eaten sandwich, I let my thoughts wander. Had I truly wasted the past 15 years of my life? The question hit like a punch to the gut. Not only had my marriage crumbled, but even the one thing I cherished most, my role as Carrie's father, was now shrouded in uncertainty. Though I still felt connected to her, biologically, she wasn't mine. The weight of that realization settled over me like a dark cloud. I couldn't unlearn what I now knew, couldn't go back to the blissful ignorance that once allowed me to believe everything was fine. One thing was clear. George would face the consequences of his betrayal. Our years of friendship meant nothing now. In fact, with a friend like him, I felt I'd have been better off with outright enemies. And Jenna, she, too, would have to answer for her actions. Did she know Carrie wasn't mine? Even if she hadn't known for sure, she had still hidden her infidelity, carried on the facade, and let me believe a lie for years. And worst of all, she'd been unfaithful on our wedding day, with my best man, no less. The memory of their whispered conversation I'd overheard played in my mind again. Twice a month, he'd said. Twice a month, they met, and I was none the wiser. The anger surged, threatening to overwhelm me. I knew I needed to get away, to find solitude before I did something rash. I grabbed my phone and called Jenna. She picked up after a couple of rings, her tone neutral. "Hello, Kurt." "Hey," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'll be spending the night in Albuquerque. Need to prep for tomorrow's auction." "Oh," she replied, a hint of curiosity in her voice. "Well, okay then. Have a safe trip." I rarely went to Albuquerque for auctions, so this was a noticeable deviation from my usual routine. Part of me wondered if she'd seize the opportunity to meet with George, but I knew it wouldn't be easy for her to come up with a plausible excuse regarding Carrie. My parents lived nearby, and she'd have to explain her absence if she went anywhere that evening. Nevertheless, I resolved to keep checking her phone tracker sporadically to see if she ventured out. The drive to Albuquerque was long and gave me plenty of time to strategize. I aimed to purchase at least 20 cars at the auction, including a Mazda Miata I'd promised to track down for the department head at the university. Arrangements had already been made for the cars to be delivered to my lot after the auction. However, this created another dilemma. Who could I trust to inspect and service the vehicles? George was out of the question. Once his current batch of routine inspections and repairs was done, I had no intention of giving him any more business. He would likely hear about my haul of cars and start dreaming of dollar signs, inflating his charges like he always did. But that wasn't going to happen. I'd keep the news quiet until I found someone else, someone reliable, to take over the job. As I neared Albuquerque, I made a mental note to consult with a local auction dealer about finding a skilled and dependable mechanic who could inspect the cars before they were shipped to our small town. Arriving around 9 p.m., I checked into a Best Western hotel. I wasn't about to splurge on an expensive room, even as the owner of a thriving dealership. Company funds weren't for luxury. The room was clean and comfortable, and the bed seemed inviting enough, but sleep refused to come. Instead, my mind raced, replaying the events of the past few weeks. Jenna's betrayal haunted me, especially the knowledge that it began on the very day we exchanged vows. How could she justify that? How could she continue the affair for years without a shred of guilt, or at least not enough to confess? I grabbed my phone, opening the tracking app. Her phone's location hadn't changed. It was still at home. At least for now, I thought, but the knowledge brought little comfort. I set the phone aside and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The more I thought about our marriage, the more cracks I saw in its foundation. Sure, it hadn't been perfect, what marriage was. But I had believed we shared something real. That belief was gone now, shattered into pieces as sharp and jagged as my thoughts. I had once believed in the exclusivity of our love, convinced that we had built something unshakable. But now, I realized I had been wrong from the very beginning. Those early years after our wedding had been far from smooth. though I chalked it up to normal growing pains. Jenna and I hadn't planned on starting a family right away. We agreed to wait 3 or 4 years, hoping to have 3 children eventually. But Carrie's arrival disrupted everything. Now, learning that my best friend had been the root cause of that disruption made every struggle feel meaningless. 14 years of effort to build a family, overshadowed by this revelation, seemed wasted. If Jenna hadn't been involved with George, perhaps things would have been different. Maybe Carrie would have been my child, and maybe Jenna wouldn't have had such a difficult pregnancy. Complications that shaped her reluctance to have more children. Instead, George had ruined it all, starting on our wedding day when he seduced my future wife. And even now, he continued to disrupt our lives, entertaining Jenna at least twice a month, while likely mocking me behind my back as the oblivious Pole. The thought made my anger bubble to the surface again. George had to face the consequences. Lying in the hotel bed, I tried to calm myself. My mind raced, playing scenarios of confrontation and revenge. I needed to regain control or risk another sleepless night. Turning on the TV, I settled on a mindless comedy, letting the humor ease the tension. By 11 p.m., I felt calm enough to sleep. Tomorrow would be a busy day, and I needed my rest. The auction the next day went smoothly. I managed to snag excellent cars at great prices while networking with other dealers from the Albuquerque area. Though I didn't find a Mazda Miata at the auction itself, 2 dealers mentioned they had one each, one red and the other black. I negotiated tentative deals, pending confirmation of my client's preferred color. Both dealers seemed eager to work with me, assuring they'd handle the details once I finalized the purchase. I couldn't help but wonder why I hadn't frequented this auction more often. The camaraderie among fellow dealers, along with the opportunity to expand my operations, was refreshing. For a brief time, my professional pursuits provided a welcome distraction from my personal turmoil. Later that afternoon, I met with the lawyer my attorney had referred me to. The news was anything but encouraging. If I pursued a divorce, I faced losing half of my assets, along with potential alimony and child support payments for a child who wasn't even biologically mine. It felt like a crushing blow, but it also clarified my next steps. Divorce wasn't the answer, at least not yet. Instead, I decided to leave Jenna with George's child, along with the house. I'd pay off the mortgage, keeping my name on it, ensuring she couldn't sell it without my consent. As long as I continued covering taxes and utilities while living elsewhere, the house would remain tied to me. She'd have no way to claim it outright. But my business was another matter. Although registered as a corporation, I feared it wasn't adequately shielded from potential claims. A consultation with my business lawyer became an immediate priority. Returning home that evening, utterly drained, I informed Jenna of my fatigue as I made my way to the bedroom. "I'm beat," I muttered, planning to shower and call it an early night. "Do you want dinner?" she asked, her tone softer than usual. "No, I had a late lunch," I replied, grateful she at least cared enough to ask. The shower was a rare moment of bliss, as if the water could wash away my troubles, if only for a moment. Though my problems persisted, the simple act of cleaning myself felt like a reset. When I finally crawled into bed, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning, I woke early, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. At the office, I buried myself in spreadsheets and financial reports, mapping out my next moves. I informed Paul about the 23 cars I'd purchased and instructed Anna to halt any new assignments for George, emphasizing discretion. Anna raised an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" she asked. "You're invaluable, Anna," I said with a tired smile. "Just trust me on this." At precisely 9 a.m., I called my business lawyer to discuss strategies for protecting my dealership. "Your business is registered, but Jenna could still force a sale to claim half its value," he warned. "Consider selling it preemptively, transferring ownership to someone you trust, or restructuring it entirely." The suggestion hit me hard. Selling the dealership I'd built from the ground up felt like surrender, but if it meant safeguarding my livelihood from Jenna's potential claims, it was worth considering. For now, the decisions loomed ahead, each one heavier than the last. But one thing was certain: Jenna and George would no longer control the narrative. This was my fight, and I intended to win. "I can't. It's my life," I retorted to my lawyer, feeling the weight of his advice. Let me mull it over and get back to you by week's end. The suggestion hit hard. I had poured sweat and tears into building my business. It was as close to a child as I'd ever had. Unlike Carrie, I thought bitterly, as another wave of rage bubbled under the surface. But I knew better than to let my emotions take control. Years of running a business had taught me how to compartmentalize, and that skill would serve me well now. I redirected my focus to work, knowing it was the one thing I could control. My first task was to contact Doug, the client interested in the Miata. "Doug, Kurt Kaminsky here," I began. "I've got a lead on 2 Miatas, red and black. Still interested?" "If the price is right," he replied. "Which color do you recommend? Let me show you both, and we'll crunch the numbers together. Even if it doesn't work out, I'll have no trouble selling it." Doug chuckled. "Fair enough, but what's your pick?" "Red makes a bold statement, but the color fades faster. Black's more elegant but heats up like a sauna. Planning to keep it garaged?" "Yeah," he confirmed. "Then red it is. When can we meet? Monday or Tuesday work for you?" "Perfect. I'll call when I'm close." Hanging up, I called the dealer with the red Miata to negotiate a swap. He was eager, particularly for a BMW sitting on my lot for months. Its resale prospects were better in a larger city, and I was happy to make the trade. Meanwhile, George showed up with several cars that still needed repairs. His flexible schedule as an independent contractor usually worked in my favor, but seeing him now only stoked my simmering anger. While my sales team discussed the impending arrival of 23 cars from the auction, George overheard and couldn't resist inquiring. "Hey Kurt, when are those cars coming in? Need to plan my workload," he said casually. "The auction house is handling the delivery," I replied coolly. "Probably late next week or early the following." It took every ounce of restraint not to snap at him. Instead, I forced a polite chuckle as he walked away, though my fists clenched the moment he was out of sight. That weekend, I avoided Jenna entirely, burying myself in yard work and errands. Checking her phone tracker had become a redundant exercise. I no longer cared where she went or what excuses she concocted. The idea of raising another man's child, and the betrayal behind it, felt unforgivable. By Monday, I was back at the car show to finalize the Miata trade. The BMW deal went smoothly, and I stayed for lunch with the dealer, enjoying a rare camaraderie in a business that often felt isolating. Driving back in the fiery red Miata, the wind tousling my hair, I felt a rare sense of freedom. For a moment, I allowed myself to indulge in the present, unburdened by the weight of my personal life. As I pulled into the driveway, the Miata's engine hummed with satisfaction. Jenna glanced out the window, catching sight of the car, and called Carrie to join her. They both stepped outside, their expressions a mix of curiosity and surprise. "Why do you need this car, honey?" Jenna asked, her tone teetering between patronizing and condescending. "We need something with a backseat for Carrie." I gave her a tight smile. "Just picked it up from Albuquerque for a client. Thought you might want to take a ride." Her gaze lingered on me, searching for a crack in my demeanor, but I refused to give her one. This was my moment, not hers. The Miata wasn't just a car. It was a statement, one of control, of independence, and of reclaiming something she and George had tried to take from me. "No, honey, I'm not a fan of small cars," Jenna replied with a hint of disdain. Turning to my daughter, I called, "Carrie, come on, let's go for a ride." "No, Dad," she snapped, rolling her eyes. "I already get teased enough because of my last name. I don't want to be seen with a Polish used car salesman." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, sharp and unexpected. I froze, staring at her in disbelief. Where had this venom come from? Glancing at Jenna, I saw her dismiss Carrie's remark as if it were nothing, her expression impassive. That stung even more. My wife's indifference to our daughter's blatant disrespect was a slap in the face. Both the women in my house had turned against me, it seemed. I forced myself to stay calm, masking my frustration. "I'm going for another drive. I'll be back later," I announced, climbing back into the Miata and pulling out of the driveway. The engine growled as I navigated the streets of Silver City, frustration driving me aimlessly until I returned home around 9:30 p.m. Heading straight upstairs, I took a long shower, hoping to rinse away the tension. But when I stepped out, Jenna was waiting. Her arms crossed as she flipped on the lights, nearly blinding me. "Are you sulking because we didn't fall in love with your little sports car?" she sneered. "Aren't you going to spend time with your family? You're not just Polish, you're childish." Her mocking tone lit a fire inside me. This wasn't the woman I'd married. Or maybe it was, and I'd been blind to it all along. George's influence was evident. The disrespect for my heritage, now mirrored by Carrie, likely stemmed from years of him poisoning her thoughts. And yet, the cruelest irony remained. Carrie wasn't even my biological child. "Looks like you and your daughter would rather do without a pole around," I snapped, my voice icy. "So you might as well just leave." The tension in the house became unbearable after that. Conversations were curt, and the silence between us grew deafening. I threw myself into my work, eager for distractions. Doug stopped by the lot that week to inspect the Miata, his enthusiasm breaking through my sullen mood. "This is perfect," he said, a grin spreading across his face as we finalized the deal. I gave him a great price, $3,000 below the Kelley Blue Book value. Before leaving, he added, "My best friend handles the university's fleet purchases. They rotate out about 16 cars every 2 years. I'll put him in touch with you." "Always happy to do business," I replied, shaking his hand. "And I'll make sure he gets a great deal too." Moments like these reminded me why my business thrived. It wasn't just about the cars, it was about people. Treating them well, earning their trust, and showing appreciation had always been my approach. Later that week, my lawyer called. "Kurt, I think I've got a solution to your concerns. Can you come in this afternoon?" "Absolutely," I said, eager to move forward. Anything to get me out of that suffocating house. The meeting was productive, the plan solid. It would take 2 weeks to execute, but I felt confident in the outcome. In the meantime, I began quietly moving personal items and tools into a nearby apartment. On the surface, everything appeared normal at home, but I was preparing for the inevitable. I ensured Jenna wouldn't notice the changes, timing my moves while she and Carrie were out or busy. That Monday, I gathered my employees for our regular meeting. As they settled in, I took a deep breath and began. "Good morning, everyone. As you know, the cars from the auction arrived yesterday afternoon. They've all been inspected and are ready for sale. Starting today, we won't be using George for any more work. If he asks, just tell him we're going in a different direction." I paused, wiping away a tear that caught me off guard. "You've all been fantastic. You're like family to me, which makes this next part difficult. I've sold the business." The room fell silent, their surprise palpable. I continued, "Nothing about your roles will change, except for Anna. She'll be taking on some of my duties and will receive a well-deserved raise. I'll still be around in an advisory capacity and might sell a car now and then, but I won't interfere with your sales." The team began congratulating Anna, recognizing her dedication and leadership. After the meeting, as we filtered out of the conference room, I found George waiting in the hallway. "Hey, why wasn't I included in the meeting?" he asked, a mix of confusion and irritation on his face. "Because it was for staff only," I replied coolly. "And you're not an employee." George's face fell. "I see the cars have arrived. I'll get started on them." "No need," I said firmly. "They're already prepared for sale." His brow furrowed in confusion. "But I always inspect the cars." "I've sold the business," I interrupted, my voice unwavering. "The new owner has decided to go in a different direction." The shock on his face was satisfying, but I kept my composure. This was just the beginning of the reckoning George and Jenna had coming. I decided to keep it short. Sometimes, less was more. "I can't believe you sold the business," George exclaimed, his tone tinged with disbelief. But I knew better. It wasn't shock for my sake. He was making it about himself. "What now?" he asked. "You can pick up your check for the past 2 weeks," I replied bluntly. "It's not much. Anna didn't need your services often." George looked stunned, realizing he wasn't going to get the chance to work on the new cars. I didn't care. He deserved less than nothing after everything. The only thing holding me back was the fact that I wasn't ready for a confrontation. Not yet. Later, I sat down with Anna in my office. I'd grown to respect her deeply over the years, and I trusted her with the next phase of my plan. Anna, I began, my voice steady. Everything we discuss stays between us. Understood? Of course, Kurt, she assured me. You can count on me. Good. Here's the deal. I've set up 2 companies, both registered in Nevada. One owns the parking lot, the other owns the business. I hold all the shares in both. Eventually, I'm divorcing Jenna, but I don't want her getting the business. That's why I've sold it, on paper at least. She can try to take half, but by the time she files, the proceeds will be long gone. Anna's brows furrowed, but she listened intently. Does Jenna know yet? I shook my head. No, and she won't. Not until it's too late. She'll keep the house. I've paid off the mortgage, but I'll cover taxes and utilities to prevent her from claiming abandonment. The rest? She'll have to figure it out. Anna's expression hardened when I told her about Jenna's affair with George and the truth about Carrie. Carrie isn't mine, I said flatly. I suspect she's George's, though I'm not sure if either of them knows. They'll figure it out soon enough. Her shock turned to a quiet, steely resolve. What do you need me to do? She asked. First, I said, I need you to order a new sign and letterhead. We're renaming the business to Helpless Cars. Anna blinked, puzzled. Helpless? Why? I smirked. It tells the whole story. Someday, I'll explain. For now, just trust me. She nodded, still curious but unwavering in her support. As I left the office, I felt a rare sense of relief. Things were in motion, and I had someone I could rely on to see it through. 2 hours into my drive to Albuquerque, my phone buzzed. It was Jenna. I hadn't expected her to call so soon, but this was familiar territory. Me leaving, her reaching out, the cycle repeating. This time, though, I had no intention of returning. Hello? I answered, keeping my tone neutral. Kurt, what's going on? She asked, her voice hesitant. Nothing much. Just heading to Albuquerque, I replied flatly. Why? She pressed. To pick up a car, I said, offering no more than that. She hesitated before continuing. George called. He said you sold the business. I couldn't help but scoff. Did he now? Funny how he's suddenly so interested in my life. Is it true? She asked, panic creeping into her voice. Yes, I said simply. You don't have to be embarrassed by being married to a used car salesman anymore. Kurt, shouldn't we have discussed this first? What about our livelihood? This was my company, Jenna. I owned it before we got married, and I sold it. End of story. Did you at least get a good price? She asked, likely worried about her standard of living. I used the money to pay off the house, I said coldly. You'll only need to worry about utilities and taxes now. Her voice rose with panic. What about food? Gas? Insurance? Guess I overlooked that. Maybe you could work more hours, I suggested, my tone biting. When are you coming home? She asked, desperation thick in her voice. I paused, knowing this was the moment of truth. I'm not, I said simply. What? Her voice cracked. Kurt, please, you can't do this. I've already made my decision, I said, my voice steady. Don't worry, you'll figure it out. You said as much when I left that night. What about Carrie? She asked, trying to appeal to my emotions. She's your daughter. Is she? I interrupted. Because the girl who's ashamed of her last name and her dad being a used car salesman sure doesn't act like it. She's just a teenager, Kurt. Jenna pleaded. You can't take her words to heart. It doesn't matter anymore, I said, cutting her off. I'm not coming back. You don't have to be embarrassed of me anymore. Before she could respond, I hung up and powered off my phone. Let her stew on that. Let her figure out what to do without me. For the first time in years, I felt free. I knew Jenna would try calling me back, and when I didn't answer, she'd grow frustrated. As the tension from the call eased, I focused on the open road, letting the drive to Albuquerque calm my nerves. I suspected her next move would be to contact George, seeking answers or reassurance, and perhaps to recount what I'd said. When I arrived at my destination, I turned my phone back on and saw 5 missed messages. 3 were from Jenna, 1 from George, and the last from Anna. I decided to call Anna first. Hi, Anna. Sorry, my phone was off. I needed a break from unwanted calls, I explained. I figured as much, she replied. Your wife and George both called me, asking where you were. I told them you don't own the business anymore and that you wouldn't be coming back. I hope everything's okay. Great work, Anna, I said, a hint of relief in my voice. If they bother you again, remind them harassment is a crime. She chuckled. I'll remember that. But Kurt, you're not alone. I know you feel like you've lost family, but we're still here for you. You're family to us and always will be. Thank you, Anna. You don't know how much that means to me, I said sincerely. Your husband is a lucky man. And he reminds me all the time, she said warmly. Don't ever take that for granted, Kurt. I won't, I promised, ending the call with a renewed sense of gratitude. I debated calling Jenna or George but decided against it. Let them stew. Instead, I met with a car dealer who admired the Audi I brought and eagerly offered a trade. You're sure about this exchange? I feel like I'm getting the better end of the deal, he said. I'm not here to profit, just to enjoy the ride, I replied. 30 minutes later, I was on the road again, the wind in my hair as I drove the new Miata. For the next 2 weeks, I roamed the Southwest, covering northern New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Colorado. I stayed connected to Anna, checking in occasionally to ensure the business was running smoothly. Calls from Jenna and George continued, their tones shifting from annoyance to apologies and finally to resentment. I shrugged it off. When Jenna reported that the credit cards had been canceled, I laughed. George's attempt to paint me as a villain for leaving them only amused me further. One day, my lawyer called to inform me that Jenna was threatening legal action. I returned his call. Hello, Kurt speaking. Hi, Kurt. Yes, your wife has been making threats, but as long as you're paying for the house, she'll have a hard time proving abandonment. Good to hear. I have something better, though, I said. A recording of her telling me not to come back. It's gold. Send it over, he said. If she causes any trouble, I'll share it with her lawyer. Thanks, I replied. I'll check in next week to see how it's going. Over the next 3 months, I drove more than 8,000 miles, exploring the beauty of the American West. The Miata wasn't luxurious, but it was a thrill to drive. Occasionally, I caught the admiring glances of bored middle-aged women, but I wasn't looking for anything. Legally, I was still married, and emotionally, I was far from ready. Eventually, I returned to Silver City and was greeted warmly at Helpless Auto by the team, including a few new hires. Anna's smile widened when she saw me, and she wrapped me in a tight hug. You handled everything beautifully, I told her later in her office. Let's celebrate. Can you close the store by 5? I'd like to take everyone out for food and drinks at Wrangler's. Absolutely. They'll love it, she said, her enthusiasm contagious. At the restaurant that evening, I reconnected with the team. As the night wound down, only Anna and I remained. She looked at me with quiet resolve. Kurt, you might feel like you're powerless and lost, but you're not. You trusted the wrong people, but that doesn't mean you've lost yourself. Her words struck a chord. So, you figured it out, I said. It took me a while, she admitted. But your hint about the new name stuck with me. You've been through so much, and those jokes about being Polish never defined you. They insulted your heritage, but not your worth. Thank you, Anna, I said, my voice heavy with emotion. You're the reason I came back. I needed to see how you handled everything. You didn't just fill my shoes, you made your own. You were a great mentor, she said, her gratitude evident. We parted ways, and I returned to my apartment. After 3 months away, the air was stale, but the evening breeze brought life back to the space. I grabbed a beer and sat on the terrace overlooking the pool. Families laughed and splashed below, a stark contrast to the weight of my own fractured family. Glancing at the clock, I realized it was time. It was time for a confrontation. I grabbed my keys, hopped into the Miata, and drove to my house. The yard was unkempt, the landscaping neglected, a reflection of the chaos within. The porch light was on, signaling that Jenna was home. I knocked. Moments later, Carrie opened the door, her eyes widening in surprise. Dad? She said, her voice uncertain. Hi, Carrie, I said calmly. Is your mom home? She stammered, then turned to yell, Mom? Jenna's high-pitched voice echoed from the kitchen. What's wrong? Carrie kept staring at me, then shouted louder, Dad's here. Jenna appeared from around the corner, her face paling when she saw me. Before either could react further, George stepped out of the bedroom, wearing nothing but his underwear. I laughed bitterly. Well, isn't this a family reunion? Mom, Dad, and child. What a picture. I couldn't have fired him, I said, addressing George's blatant freeloading. Jenna cut me off sharply. What about groceries and gas for the car? All utilities and insurance are covered, but you left. Who's going to handle that? You had a job last I checked, I retorted coldly. Did you lose it while I was away? Or did you think you could just waltz into my life and take over? My words hung heavy in the air as Jenna squared her shoulders, her defiance shining through. I'm not leaving my home, she said firmly, her voice rising. Correction, I replied, my tone steady. This is my home. It was mine before we got married, and only my name is on the deed. You walked out, Jenna snapped. That makes it mine now. That's not how the law works, Jenna, I shot back. As long as I'm paying utilities and taxes, I remain the legal owner. Even though I've been gone for a while, this is still my property. But don't worry, I'll give you and your partner until the end of next month to find somewhere else to live. Just make sure you take your daughter with you. Jenna's face twisted in confusion. What do you mean, your daughter? She's our daughter, she said, her voice trembling with both anger and desperation. You couldn't have put it more perfectly, I said with a bitter chuckle. I turned toward Carrie, who stood frozen in the doorway. Carrie, I know you don't like being called Polish. Well, good news for you, you're not. Your real father isn't me. It's George. A deafening silence filled the room. Jenna's mouth opened, but no words came out. George looked as though the floor had dropped from beneath him. Finally, Jenna whispered, What? Yes, Jenna, I continued, the edge in my voice cutting through her disbelief. Your careless actions on our wedding day led to a child, but not mine. However, there's a silver lining, Carrie. Now you can take your real father's last name. Maybe Carrie George has a better ring to it? I wonder, I mused. Did you name her Carrie as a nod to your lover? Jenna's eyes darted toward George, who was pale and speechless. They exchanged panicked glances, neither able to form a coherent response. I shifted my attention back to George. What about you, George? Don't you think it's time to step up as a father? Lucky for you, it's just 4 more years until college. You can handle that, right? My sarcasm dripped with disdain as I pulled a folded piece of paper from my jacket pocket and handed it to them. Here's the DNA report. Take a look for yourselves. They grabbed the document, their eyes scanning it frantically. The color drained from Jenna's face as George's shoulders slumped in defeat. I turned to Carrie, who stood wide-eyed and motionless. Carrie, let your mom and George know. They'll be getting served with divorce papers next week, and with an eviction notice. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out the door. Behind me, I could hear their stunned whispers and muffled sobs, but I didn't care. Every step felt like shedding a weight I'd carried for far too long. Back at my apartment, I sat in the dim light of the living room, sipping a beer. The betrayal still stung. How long had it been going on? Did Jenna ever truly love me, or was I just a convenient pawn in her messy game? George is mocking, his Polish jokes to my face while stabbing me in the back. It all made me feel small, helpless, and used. But now, as I stared out into the night, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: clarity. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, I was taking control of my life. And that was enough. The next morning, with a hangover and a heavy heart, I visited my lawyer to initiate the divorce proceedings. It was bittersweet, finally taking control of my life, yet knowing I'd have to sell the house and split the proceeds. Thankfully, with my barely there income and another man already in Jenna's place, I hoped to avoid alimony or child support. Still, the betrayal from Jenna and George had left deep scars. The thought of rebuilding trust, whether with a man or woman, felt overwhelming. Therapy might not be a bad idea, I mused. As the legal gears turned, I returned to work at the dealership, not as the boss but just another salesman. I told my colleagues I only needed one sale a week to cover my expenses. When the courts tried to impose child support, I ensured my accounts were drained, leaving just enough for my basic needs. Jenna's lawyer would be in for a surprise. They'd find little to take. I learned from Anna that during my 3-month absence, George had tried to weasel his way back into the dealership. He visited almost daily for the first 2 weeks, desperate for work. But Anna, loyal to the core, refused him every time. Eventually, he gave up. Without his ASE certification, his only option was a low-paying job at a quick lube shop, earning $13 an hour. I couldn't help but smirk. I wondered if Jenna would finally step up and work full-time to cover their bills. When the house was officially listed, I notified Jenna. She'd already received the eviction notice and needed to vacate before the sale closed. One evening, she unexpectedly knocked on my apartment door. Reluctantly, I let her in. "What do you want, Jenna?" I asked coldly. "Can we talk?" she pleaded. "I don't think that's a good idea," I replied. "We're in the middle of a legal battle." "Please, Kurt," she said. "Just us. No lawyers. Can we at least try to have a civil conversation?" I hesitated but relented. "Fine. Let's go to Denny's." I figured a public setting would keep things calm and safe. At the diner, after some awkward pleasantries, I cut to the chase. "Why, Jenna?" She hesitated, avoiding my eyes. "I guess the simple answer is, I liked both of you and couldn't choose." "So you were seeing both of us at the same time?" I pressed. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But George warned me not to tell you. He knew it would ruin your friendship." "Then why did you say yes when I proposed?" I asked, my voice laced with disbelief. "Because I loved you," she said. "And I loved him too. But I knew George wouldn't make a good husband. So when you proposed, I ended things with him and focused on us." "But on our wedding day," I trailed off, needing to hear her say it. Tears welled up in her eyes as she nodded. "Yes. And why?" I demanded. "What was so special about that day?" "I didn't want to lose him," she confessed, her voice cracking. "And he didn't want to lose me." I let out a bitter laugh. "Well, congratulations. Now you have him, and your child." Jenna flinched, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know Carrie wasn't yours," she said. "Good news for Carrie, though," I replied, my tone sharp. "She can take her real father's last name now. Quite fitting, don't you think?" Jenna's face turned pale, and George's name hung heavy in the air between us. She looked at me with fresh tears. "Kurt, I still love you." "It's nice to hear, Jenna," I replied, my voice steady. "But I'm not sure you know what love even means." Her eyes darted to the table. "I loved you more than anything," she said softly. "Clearly you didn't," I countered. "I loved you once, but now? Now I feel nothing but contempt." Jenna realized then that our relationship was truly over. Before she left, I had one final question. "Have you ever stopped seeing him?" After a long pause, she admitted, "No, we never stopped. There were quiet times, but we still met, usually twice a month." I nodded, biting back the anger bubbling inside me. "One more thing," I said. "About a year ago, your behavior toward me changed. Why?" Her cheeks flushed, and she looked away. "George started pushing for a threesome," she muttered. "I might have considered it if you were involved, but I knew you wouldn't. His persistence made me resent you for something I knew you wouldn't agree to. It's twisted, I know. Did you go through with it?" I asked. "No," she whispered, "but I thought about it. And then you left, and everything fell apart." "Well," I said, standing up, "now you're free to explore all the possibilities. Your choices no longer affect me." For months later, our divorce was finalized. George sat in the back of the courtroom, avoiding eye contact. As we exited, Jenna turned to me and said, "Maybe we can grab a drink sometime. For old time's sake?" "Maybe," I replied curtly, knowing full well it would never happen. Walking away, I couldn't help but think about the mess they'd made. Jenna and George could have each other now. Let them figure out how to rebuild their lives. As for me, I'd continue driving my Miata through life, demanding the respect I deserved, Polish jokes and all. What do you think about Kurt's decision to leave and rebuild his life after such a betrayal? Should he have handled things differently with Jenna and George, or did he take the best path forward? Share your thoughts below.